Consider supporting this podcast on Patreon. On this episode of the What is Asia podcast, I interview Ming-hsi Chu, a Ph.D. student at Northwestern University, to talk about the war crime trials that took place in China at the conclusion of World War II. Ming-hsi, thanks for joining us on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
Thank you for having me.
You talk specifically about the war crime trials of what were deemed to be war criminals at the conclusion of the Second World War. And these trials take place in China, correct?
Yes, that's right. Because I think for most audience, they are more familiar with two very big international tribunals of war crime trials. That is the Nuremberg trial in Germany and the Tokyo trial in Japan. However, these two international tribunals were responsible for adjudicating major war criminals or Class A war criminals, which means that those defendants violated crime against peace. So they are high-ranked government official or high-ranked military personnel who were responsible for initiating the war. However, according to some statistics, around 5,700 BC class war criminals were adjudicated in national jurisdictions in Asia. So it contained war criminals who committed B-class war crime, which means conventional war crimes. So they violated Geneva Conventions or the Hague Conventions. They maybe tortured civilians, or they abused POWs. So, and the Class C means they violated crime against humanity. So maybe they participated in genocide program. So I think it's important to know that in addition to the Tokyo trial, there were many Japanese war criminals were adjudicated in national jurisdictions.
Mm. And so I guess just to give people a little more context, the majority of these war criminals were Japanese, correct?
Yes. They were with Japanese nationality, so it contained some Japanese imperial subjects from the colonies. So some of them were Taiwanese or Koreans.
One question that you answer in this thesis is for the Republic of China. And again, to give people clarification, these trials are taking place between 1945 and 1949, correct? So this was before the emergence of the PRC. This was during the Republican period. You mentioned that adjudicating these cases was important for the Chinese. What symbolic importance, what legal importance, what political importance did this hold for being able to adjudicate these cases?
That's a great question. So after the mid-19th century, so after the 1842, the First Wupian War, China had been suffered from unequal treaties. Why they were unequal? Because the European countries claimed that the Chinese law was brutal or uncivilized, so that European citizens or American citizens in China could have the privilege of extraterritoriality. Extraterritoriality means that these foreign citizens were exempted by local law and local courts jurisdiction. So for example, if an American merchant committed a crime in Shanghai in, say, 1895, for example, this American citizen would not be adjudicated by Chinese court and governed by Chinese law. Instead, he would be prosecuted to American consular courts and subject to American law. So China had regarded it as a national humiliation because it labeled that China was not a civilized country. And things got changed around 1943, that most Western countries recognized China as a civilized state, so they abolished extraterritoriality. They signed a new equal treaty with China. So after China's victory over the war in 1945, these war crime trials were actually the first time that China could adjudicate foreign defendants on its own courts by its own law. So it's highly symbolic that China wanted to demonstrate their civilizedness to the world. Also, China became a very important founding member of the United Nations. So they claimed that China had become, one of the 5 great powers in the world.
Mm-hmm. Another question you tackle in your research is you talk about how China's adjudication of these war criminals incorporates a lot of international law. And one question you raise is, were these war trials subject to international law, or were the Chinese able to create something that uniquely stands on its own? And one thing, just to sort of lead into it, you talk about the War Criminal Trial Act. So I guess you could also sort of begin to answer what was that in your response.
So as I mentioned before, major war criminals, namely Class A war criminals, should be tried in an international tribunal in Tokyo. And BC class war criminals should be adjudicated in national jurisdictions. So China had to establish war crime trial tribunals in their national jurisdiction, because it's a national jurisdiction, so that China needed a domestic law to set up the courts, to stipulate what kind of behavior would constitute a war crime. So at the time, Legislative Yuan, which was the central legislature in China, passed this War Crime Trial Act to establish courts and to stipulate relevant definition of war crimes. And if you compare this War Crime Trial Act with Tokyo Charter or Nuremberg Charter, you will find that they are very similar in terms of the structure of the law, or they are highly similar stipulations. So my method to deal with this question is first to compare the Chinese domestic law, the War Crime Trial Act, with these two charters. And then I believe that by doing so, I could find out the Chinese government's official stance toward these war criminals.
Can you give a little more insight into one thing that you talk about is how the War Crime Trial Act, WCTA, is similar to, but not necessarily the same as international law. So can you describe a little bit more what you mean by that?
Yes, for example, according to international law, only enemies, citizens, and military personnel could be tried as a war criminal. I think it's very natural because it's hard to imagine that you put your allied soldiers to the war crime tribunal. Like the U.S. would never put a British soldier to its war crime tribunal, right? However, if you see the wording of the War Crime Trial Act of China, and then you would see that all foreigners could be tried as a war criminal. Also, it stipulated a very strict punishment compared with Tokyo Charter and the Nuremberg Charter. For example, at the time when international lawyers from the US, Britain, Russia, France were drafting the Nuremberg Charter, they had concern over we call superior responsibility, which means that if a lower ranked soldier committed a war crime, would his superior officer have legal responsibility over his behaviors? And they thought it's too controversial. So if you look up both the Nuremberg Charter and the Tokyo Charter, you cannot find such stipulations. However, it's explicitly stated in the WCTA that the superior officer would be responsible for his interior officer's behavior. Another example is that in a domestic jurisdiction, if you do something forced by the law, or you were enforcing a government policy or a law, you would be immune from criminal responsibility. This is called due obedience in criminal law. And according to Nuremberg Charter and the Tokyo Charter, if a soldier did, or if a soldier committed a war crime because of due obedience, the court was obliged to consider mitigation. However, the WCTA did not contain such a mitigation clause. So after such comparison, I found that the WCTA was actually stricter than these international legal tenets.
So one aspect of your thesis that you talk about is how the legislative yuan, which is the branch of the Republic of China's government that creates and passes laws and policy. You talk about how there was this friction between the legislative yuan and the judicial yuan, and the judicial yuan was the court system. How did these two clash in terms of the WTCA, and what effects did the judicial yuan have on war crime trials?
First of all, I would like to briefly introduce what judicial yuan is. Judicial yuan is still a very important branch in the Taiwanese constitution nowadays. Actually, it's a central branch that is responsible for judicial administration. However, it has a very special function. We call it unifying legal interpretations in China. So at the time, if a government or a court had some questions about how to interpret a specific legal stipulation, they could apply the judicial yuan to convey senior judges at the Supreme Court to unify the legal interpretations in China. So, for example, if court in Shanghai had a different legal interpretation from a court in Beijing, and then these judges could file a petition to the judicial yuan saying that, oh, we don't know which interpretation was correct. And then the judicial yuan would convey a meeting from all senior judges at Supreme Court to decide which one is correct. And after that, the legal interpretation would be unified by the senior judges. So that was the case in the war crime trials too. So at the time, we could see that some judges found that the WCTA departed from international law, or some administrative officers found the same thing. So they petitioned to the judicial yuan saying that, oh, the WCTA departed from international law. For example, the definition of the war criminals were too broad, which included every foreigners, in addition to foreigners from enemy countries. So the court, interestingly, the judicial yuan cited international law to limit the scope of the WCTA. So it would say something like, according to international law, war criminals should be only citizens from enemy countries. So we should follow international law. We should not follow the wordings of the WCTA. For me, it's a very interesting phenomenon because it's a national jurisdiction. The judiciary should be bound by the legislative decisions. But in this case, in practice, we can see that international law seemed to have a higher effect than the legislative decision. So I think that's the most important finding of my thesis.
Mm-hmm. And are there instances when the WCTA in your research was used for political reasons? And was the judicial yuan able to, curb the ability of the government to prosecute people purely for political reasons over actual war crimes?
I think so. A very important example is about Taiwanese status in the war crime trials. So, for example, at the time, many politicians wanted to prosecute Taiwanese soldiers as traitors who committed treason. Because as I mentioned before, Taiwan was a Japanese colony during World War II. So many Taiwanese were drafted to join the Japanese army during the war. However, some Chinese politicians considered Taiwanese as Han Chinese, ethnic Chinese. So they claimed that Taiwanese should be treated as traitors, not war crimes, because war criminals should be foreigners, but Taiwanese people are ethnic Chinese who violated treason under the General Criminal Code. However, the judicial yuan insisted that when these Taiwanese joined the Japanese army, they were Japanese citizens. So they should be treated as war criminals rather than traitors. It's a big difference because the Treason Act was much more stricter than the War Crime Trial Act. They could be sentenced to death. They could confiscate all of their properties, and they will be prohibited from being a government officer in the future forever. So if these Taiwanese were adjudicated as, a traitor and who violated the crime of treason, the results would be very, very different. Right? So here, I think the court insisted that Taiwanese should be tried as war criminals. It represented that the court wanted to be subject to international law instead of subject to public opinion or to politicians' opinions.
Mhm. Just a couple more questions before we wrap up our interview here. So, one question that I found myself asking a lot of our interview participants is questions about legacy. So, what was the legacy of the War Crime Trial Act? And specifically, how is it talked about in Taiwan and China today? How is it taught? And how is it informed legal scholars and historians in modern times?
This is a very good question, because before I entered the master program at Taiwan University, I actually had never heard about this BC class war criminal trials in Taiwan. So the history was actually concealed to a very high degree. Why? Because I think in this judgment, the Chinese judges wanted to demonstrate that China was a civilized country. So they said that, my dear defendant, if you wanted to investigate our civilians, you should follow the due process of law. You should not torture them. You should not abuse them. You should use a civilized way to proceed your criminal investigation process. Right. However, the judgment was delivered in Taipei in 1947 in March. The judgment I cited, okay, and at the time, the Chiang Kai-shek administration was doing something the opposite in Taiwan, because 1947 was the year of the February 20th incident, right? So the Kuomintang, the Chinese nationalist army, went to Taiwan and tortured Taiwanese citizens without due process. And after 1949, when the Chiang Kai-shek administration restarted its governance in Taiwan, Taiwan became an authoritarian regime. So if they emphasize too much of this rule of law, civilizedness of adjudicating foreigners, and then you would become a large sarcasm, right? You would say, you treat war criminals so well, even better than your own citizens. So I think this history has been concealed for a long time. And for me, it demonstrated different possibilities that actually around 1947, China could have become a very progressive, civilized, liberal rule of law state. But the Cold War structure ruined everything. That Chiang Kai-shek went back to his old path of building an authoritarian regime, a party state instead of a true democratic and liberal state. So I think that's the implication of my research.
And just my last question before we wrap up here,
Sure.
if someone's listening to this and they want to know more about the Republic of China period or China during World War II or the war crime trials, what would be a couple of books that you would recommend?
I think in 2016, um, Professor Barack Kushner at Cambridge University published a wonderful book called Men to Devils and Devils to Men. This book won the John King Fairbank Prize of AHA that year. It's a highly readable and very interesting, very comprehensive book about the nationalist China's war crime trials. But Professor Kushner is a historian, so his analysis focuses on the social and political aspect of nationalist China's war crime trials. And I completed my master's thesis at Taiwan University College of Law. So my analysis focuses on law instead of those social and political aspects. I think that's a reason why my research could further contribute to the field on the top of Professor Kushner's comprehensive book.
For anyone else who's interested in exploring more content, you can go to the What is Asia podcast YouTube channel or go to nakotadefonso.com for more content. We'll see you in the next episode.